All right, we haven't had a whole lot of neo-prog outfits this year, so let's dive in and hope that we can really get 2023 into the neo-prog sphere. Let's dive into it. Threnody of a Dead Queen by Comedy of Errors. And I keep wanting to pronounce that as Serenity, but it's Serenity with a lisp, Threnody. Anyway, Comedy of Errors is your typical neo-prog band where they got their start and formation back in the 80s, but didn't actually put anything out until about the 2000s. We saw this with Mystery a couple weeks ago, and we see this with a lot of neo-prog bands. And they really broke onto the scene with their 2013, their sophomore album of Fanfare and Fantasy. This was the one that really got me into them, and their 2015 album of Spirit was one of my favorite albums of that year, not just in the neo-prog sphere, but in the prog sphere entirely. One of the things I really do love about Comedy of Errors is that they have this light wistfulness that you really rarely hear within the neo-prog sphere. Neo-prog is usually dark, it's dour, it's melodramatic, it's very operatic, it's got a lot of theatricalities about it, and I feel as though a lot of that is still baked into it with a lot of the singing styles that we have with the main singer, a lot of that really chuggy guitars with really fun keyboard playthroughs and kind of intermixed there. But there's always this sense of lightness. There's always this sense of very airy and almost like a retro prog celebration, like something you would hear from like Yes in that case. And I don't know, I always thought that a Yes sound, especially from like a John Anderson kind of a sound, like that very celebratory, very almost like hippy-dippy aspect of it is almost antithetical to the neo-prog movement, which was very like critical, very like analytical of things, and even though it had that kind of sense of poetry about it, it was always much more of a dour poetry rather than more of a flowery poetry. I'm getting a little bit carried away from myself. The next two releases from them, House of the Mind, I was less than stellar over, but last year's album of The Time Machine actually was pretty good. It was one of my favorite neo-prog records from that year, from last year. So right off the heels of The Time Machine, we're barely half a year afterwards, we get Threnody for a Dead Queen. And yeah, this album, I want to kind of get my criticisms of this album kind of out of the way first, and some of the issues that I have with it. The first is that it feels more like a cleaning out of the closet. It feels more like a leftovers, we didn't quite know what to do, kind of like first drafts and half-finished tracks half the time on this record. It doesn't really feel like a fully flushed out record with tracks like We Are Such Stuff as Dreams Are Made Of, Through the Veil, and Our Little Life is Rounded with Asleep. These tracks feel like demos. They feel like, half-formed ideas that they're just kind of playing around with, trying to figure out what to do with, and it never really has any kind of fully flushed out or realized ideas on them. And it makes for a little bit of a disjointed listen. The other issue that I have with this album is kind of the pacing of it. It starts with two long tracks. The first track, Summer Lies Beyond, at 15 minutes plus, and the seventh seal, which is 14 minutes. These two tracks really encaptures what I love about the neo-prog sphere and what I love about Comedy of Errors as a whole. And the fact that these two are really like right up at the front, it leaves the rest of the album really to flounder and to kind of waste away. Even with the title track of Threnody for a Dead Queen at 12 and a half minutes, that track takes a long time to get going, and I feel as though it's being dragged down by these kind of half-thoughts, not quite fully fleshed out tracks that it wanders until about the final 4 minutes when it finally picks itself up and actually decides where it wants to go at the end. And because we have floundered for so long, I just feel myself lost, and that big payoff at the end of the track kind of falls flat. And I feel as though this is them jamming in the studio, trying to find the ideas, trying to get the semblance of what the songs want to be and what they want to sound like, so that when the song finally does emerge by the end, they could have started with that and then built the rest of the song around it. But I feel as though they're kind of putting the cart before the horse in that sense. And the final track of Funeral Dance is really just the funeral dance, but sounded like how Wendy Carlos did it with A Clockwork Orange when she was working with Stanley Kubrick. But instead of it being this big, dour, very somber, very powerful funeral march, it kind of becomes this joyful, hey, the Queen is dead, long live the Queen kind of aspect. And, you know, when we're looking over at England, and last year the Queen did kick the bucket, it's an interesting kind of... And I know that the band went into this record when the Queen was still alive, and they didn't, anticipate the Queen's passing. It's a little bit of maybe you wanted to leave this track on the cutting room floor, essentially. So, with all that out of the way, I want to talk about the things that I really did enjoy and kept me coming back to this record, because there were a few moments on this that I really did like, and really, it is those first two songs, Summer Lies Beyond and The Seventh Seal. The first track of Summer Lies Beyond really is like the type of track that draws me to Comedy of Errors and what it sets it apart from other neo-prog albums. As I mentioned, it's airy, it's got this big breath of life about it. It goes through a lot of different ebbs and flows. It's reminding me of some of my favorite moments from Spirit, where, that whole album really is just one track that goes through all these different movements and all these different kind of flavors and techniques. With The Summer Lies Beyond, it really is that kind of slice of that record where we have such a beautiful crescendo by the end, and it's very lovely, it's very airy, it's very optimistic, it sounds very, pleasant in that sense, and this is the kind of, track that I can introduce somebody to the ideas of neo-prog without having them to kind of sit down and listen to an entire album of neo-prog. And the second track of The Seventh Seal is kind of the flip side to that. Instead of it being a little bit more atmospheric, instead of it being so airy and kind of ethereal in that sense, this one's a lot more tangible. We have a lot more of the keyboard playouts. I'm loving a lot of that jamming that we have on there. It's very abrasive, very in your face in that sense. It has a very crystal clear identity that is Comedy of Errors. Like, you hear that keyboard and you're listening to Comedy of Errors. And I love the fact that they introduce it at the beginning. They have a little bit of a reminder at the midpoint, and then they pay it off right at the end. And it's structured very well in that sense. The 14 minutes goes by pretty quickly, and it just has this journey about it that I really do enjoy. And at no point do I ever feel my mind moving too far away from the track. I never find myself slipping away from it. I'm always engaged in it, and it's a lot more tangible. And so these two tracks really do I keep trying to use that, encaptures what it is that makes Comedy of Errors one of my favorite neo-prog groups that are recording today. It's just after that, they basically just let the second half of this record really flounder and really struggle to kind of keep that pace and keep that energy going. So, yeah, this record really is the definition of a mixed grab bag. Those first two tracks are really great. The rest of the album is just kind of left to wither and die. It almost feels as though somebody plucked the top of a rose and just kind of left the stem there in the bowl to wither. I think the best that I could say about this album is that it's a good kind of EP for this band rather than a full-length album. Two really great tracks with a bunch of bonus tracks kind of tacked on at the end, rather than a full-fledged studio recording in that case. I keep kind of trying to figure out why they structured it the way that they did. They should have really had The Seventh Seal start the record, have Summer Lies Beyond end the record, taken off the Funeral Dance, and maybe trimmed off some of those other kind of less than stellar tracks and really tighten this thing up. Instead of it being, practically an hour long, cut it down to maybe about 45 minutes and really polish off and really develop the tracks on here. But I have a feeling that these were just tracks that we either laying around or ideas that they didn't quite know what to do with, so they just put it onto an album, and maybe it was a contractual obligation. Who knows? In the end, I will say, Threnody for a Dead Queen by Comedy of Errors is one I would ultimately stream. It is a little bit of a shame because, Summer Lies Beyond and The Seventh Seal are two of my favorite tracks that Comedy of Errors have written, and it's just kind of floundering on this kind of oasis of an album. So yeah, that's where I'm at for Threnody of a Dead Queen. What did you guys think about this album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? How does it compare to the other neo-prog albums that have been released this year? I kind of, yeah, I don't want to compare apples to oranges, so I'm just going to leave that question out in the ether for you guys. But I would love to know what you thought. And I think that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.